March 17th, 1754. The Abbey of Saint-Benoît-sur-Loire. Behind stone walls 3 feet thick, something is roasting. Brother Jacques turns the spit slowly. Fat drips into the fire, hissing. The smell, rich, buttery, decidedly not fish, curls through the rafters. On the spit, an entire beaver, 40 pounds of glistening, butter-basted mammal, its flat tail charring at the edges. It's Friday, it's Lent. Technically, this is forbidden. Except the monks have documents, very old documents, that say otherwise. For 3.5 centuries, French monasteries have served beaver tail as fish. Tonight, that lie ends. The porter hears hoofbeats. He opens the Judas window. Outside, Bishop Montclair and 4 Vatican investigators, their faces grim in torchlight. The kitchen door bursts open. Cold air floods in. The monks freeze. The beaver keeps rotating, golden and guilty. Montclair stares at the spit. His voice cuts through the silence. "Show me the scales, brother. Show me where this fish has scales." This is how the greatest theological loophole of the Middle Ages finally collapsed. But the story begins much earlier. To understand how monks convinced the church that a rodent was seafood, we need to go back. Back to when one hungry priest looked at a beaver and saw opportunity. In 1234, a French monk bit into roasted beaver tail and called it fish. The Pope agreed. For 500 years, this lie fed thousands. This isn't just a story about medieval weirdness. It's about how power bends truth, how loopholes become law, and how hungry men will rewrite reality itself. Every modern tax shelter, every legal technicality, it depends on what your definition of is traces back to moments like this. When the church said no meat on Fridays, they weren't being arbitrary. Fasting was supposed to hurt. Sacrifice without suffering is just dinner. But monks weren't peasants. They had education, connections, and most dangerously, they had time to think. The beaver loophole didn't happen overnight. It took 3 centuries of lobbying, forged documents, and theological gymnastics that would make a lawyer blush. And here's what matters. It worked, completely. Beaver became fish in the eyes of God's representatives on earth. Think about that. Not a quiet exception, not a wink and a nod, official doctrine, written down, enforceable, real. This is the moment when bureaucracy discovered it could trump biology. When institutions learned that reality is negotiable if you have the right paperwork. The ripple effects reach into your life today. Every time a corporation is legally a person, every time chocolate milk is classified as a health drink in school cafeterias. The beaver tail was never about beavers. It was a proof of concept, a test case. How far can we bend the rules before they break? Spoiler alert, they never broke. Because the people writing the rules were the same people benefiting from breaking them. For 340 years, monks slow-roasted whole beavers on spits, basted in butter, and called it holy devotion. And no one could tell them otherwise. Because they'd done something revolutionary. They'd made their sin regulatory compliant. This is the blueprint every modern institution uses. Not to break rules, but to redefine them so thoroughly that breaking becomes impossible. France, 1203. The church has a problem. Lent demands 40 days without meat, but the nobles funding monastery construction expect something richer than turnip soup. Fish was permitted. Cod, eel, salmon, anything from water got God's blessing. But Europe's rivers were overfished. Monks needed protein, and they needed a miracle. Enter the beaver, fat, abundant, delicious. Its tail glistened with oil, flat and scaly looking. One ambitious abbot stared at that tail and saw salvation. Brother Guillaume of Lyon composed the letter that would change Lenten cuisine forever. "Holy Father," he wrote, "we seek clarification on a creature most aquatic in nature." The argument was beautifully simple. Beavers live in water. They swim like fish. That tail? Clearly scales. Aristotle himself, or so they claimed, classified it as aquatic. Here's where it gets criminal. Those Aristotle manuscripts? Completely fabricated. Monks were forging ancient Greek texts to justify their beaver cravings. And it worked, because this wasn't just about theology. It was about money, power, and the medieval equivalent of lobbying the FDA to classify pizza as a vegetable. The Vatican's response arrived in 1215. Pope Innocent III, distracted by the Fourth Lateran Council, rubber-stamped the petition. Beaver was now officially fish. French monasteries erupted in celebration. Finally, a Lenten feast worthy of their station, but they had no idea their lie would need defending for 3.5 centuries. Because once you convince the church that a 70-pound rodent is seafood, you've opened a theological door you can never fully close. Brother Etienne scratched the final Latin phrase onto vellum by candlelight. Aristotle observed that creatures of flattened tail and aquatic domain possess the cold blood of fishes. The year was 1312. Aristotle had been dead for 1600 years. The real Aristotle never mentioned beavers, but these French Benedictines weren't about to let historical accuracy stand between them and Friday dinner. The forgery operation ran from 3 monasteries along the Rhone Valley. Each produced slightly different versions of the same lie, making it appear as independent, scholarly consensus. They copied Aristotle's authentic marginalia, his note-taking style, his Greek abbreviations. Then they inserted passages about tailfish of the river with anatomical descriptions that perfectly matched beaver proportions. The monks even created a fake chain of transmission, claiming these texts came from Moorish scholars in Toledo who'd preserved lost Aristotle works. It was medieval academic laundering. By 1327, 15 monasteries were citing these forgeries in official petitions to Avignon, where the Pope held court. The paperwork looked impeccable. The philosophy looked ancient. The beavers looked delicious. Here's where it gets brilliant. They weaponized Aristotle's actual classification errors. He'd wrongly called whales fish and bats birds. The monks argued, if the great philosopher erred on those, surely our corrected beaver texts are the real discovery. The Vatican's own scholars spotted problems immediately. Beavers nurse their young, they have fur, they build wooden lodges on dry land. But 3 centuries of monk lobbying had created institutional momentum. And the monks had one unbeatable argument. Thousands of clergy across France were already eating beaver every Friday. Reversing the policy now would mean admitting the church had sanctioned meat eating during Lent for generations. So the forgeries stayed in circulation, copied into bestiaries, quoted in theology texts. The lie became canon, literally, folded into church law through sheer repetitive citation. By the 1400s, monks weren't even hiding it anymore. Recipe books appeared with sections titled Lenten Fish Preparations that included beaver tail and herb crust, beaver tail and wine sauce, and beaver tail pie. The Aristotle gambit worked for one reason. It gave church authorities plausible deniability. They could claim they were following ancient science, not just enabling gluttony. But everyone knew the truth. By 1410, every Benedictine monastery from Paris to Provence had a beaver pond. This wasn't conservation. This was livestock farming with a papal stamp of approval. The monks called them water sheep. Account ledgers show some monasteries raising over 200 beavers, specifically for Lenten slaughter. Friday feasts became legendary. While peasants choked down stale bread, monastery halls erupted with the scent of roasting beaver tail glazed in honey and wine. Recipe manuscripts reveal the excess. Beaver tail pie with saffron, beaver stew with almonds, even beaver blood sausages, all classified as fish dishes. The loophole spread like wildfire. By 1450, the Vatican had approved capybara in Venezuela, muskrat in Detroit, and puffins in Ireland, all suddenly fish. But beavers remained the crown jewel of religious meat fraud. And the monks would defend their prize for 3 more centuries. The Franciscans built entire theological arguments around beaver anatomy. One 1523 manuscript claimed beaver tails contained fish-like humors, making them aquatic by essence. When Protestant reformers mocked the practice in the 1530s, Catholic bishops doubled down. Denying beaver as fish became borderline heresy in some dioceses. The Counter-Reformation should have ended it. Instead, the Council of Trent in 1545 quietly reaffirmed all existing dietary classifications, beavers included. By 1600, beaver tail was a status symbol. Wealthy donors gifted barrels of salted beaver to cathedrals. Cardinals served it at Vatican banquets during Lent. The French perfected beaver cuisine into high art. Chef manuscripts from 1680 describe 47 ways to prepare tail, including one recipe requiring 3 days of preparation. But gluttony has a price, and in the monasteries of Normandy, the monks were about to push their fish fraud too far. Spring 1753. A traveling bishop arrives unannounced at the Abbey of St. Wandrille for Friday Vespers. What he discovers will shock the Catholic world. In the Great Hall, not delicate beaver tail, but 6 whole beavers rotating on spits, dripping fat into fire pits, basted with butter and herbs like Christmas venison. The monks insisted this was traditional fish preparation. The bishop's report to Rome described it as a blasphemous barbecue masquerading as piety. By 1754, the beaver as fish scheme had been running for over 3 centuries. Monasteries across France had turned Friday fasting into Friday feasting, with beaver tail the undisputed star of Lenten menus. But in the Burgundy region, a group of Benedictine monks made a fatal miscalculation. They decided that roasting just the tail wasn't enough. They wanted the whole animal. On a Friday in March, servants erected massive iron spits in the monastery courtyard. They impaled not 1, not 2, but 7 whole beavers, basting them in herb butter as they rotated over open flames. The aroma of slow-roasted beaver fat drifted across the valley, reaching the nostrils of Bishop Antoine Ferlus, who was traveling nearby. He stopped his carriage, confused why meat was being cooked during Lent. This wasn't some discreet tail dinner behind closed doors. This was a full medieval barbecue, visible from the public road, with monks literally calling their feast holy cod to anyone who asked. The bishop dismounted and stormed into the monastery. What he found was beyond comprehension. Monks tearing into whole roasted beavers with their hands, faces shining with grease, claiming it was all perfectly legitimate seafood. For over 300 years, the Vatican had been duped, and now the evidence was literally dripping down the chins of gluttonous monks who'd pushed the loophole too far. Bishop Ferlus documented everything. He sketched the spits, collected testimonies from servants, and even preserved a sample of the holy cod in salt. His 47-page report to Rome pulled no punches. The document detailed not just the Burgundy feast, but centuries of beaver consumption. He'd interviewed elderly monks who admitted the whole thing started with forged Aristotle texts in the 1400s. Rome's response was swift. Pope Benedict XIV convened an emergency council. The question wasn't whether beavers were fish. It was how this absurdity had survived nearly 350 years of papal oversight. Cardinals reviewed the original 1404 petition, the forged Aristotle manuscripts, the chain of bribes and favors that had protected the loophole through 14 different papacies. It was ecclesiastical fraud on an epic scale. In September 1754, the Vatican issued its correction. Beavers are mammals. They are meat. They have never been fish. Any monk caught eating beaver during Lent would face immediate excommunication. But here's the twist. The Pope's declaration only applied to Europe. French colonies in Canada, where beaver was a dietary staple, somehow kept their exemption for another 60 years. The monks of Burgundy were defrocked. Their monastery was converted to a grain storage facility, and the 7 iron spits that held their downfall were melted down to make church bells. The great beaver loophole had finally closed, but its legacy lived on in church law, proving that even the Vatican's infallibility had its limits when faced with determined, hungry monks. The beaver loophole didn't die in 1754. It evolved. While French bishops finally cracked down on spit-roasted beaver banquets, the theological logic behind it survived intact. Because the core argument was never really about beavers. It was about the Church's power to redefine reality itself through classification. In 1784, just 30 years after the beaver ban, French missionaries in South America faced a new problem. Indigenous converts refusing to give up their primary protein source during Lent. The animal in question? The capybara, the world's largest rodent weighing up to 140 pounds of pure meat, and conveniently, it spent most of its time in water. The monks dusted off the old playbook. Lives in water? Check. Swims more than it walks? Check. Tastes like fish if you squint hard enough? Debatable, but irrelevant. In 1784, the Archbishop of Quebec ruled capybaras acceptable for Lenten consumption. The Vatican never officially contradicted him. The loophole had claimed its largest victim yet. But here's where it gets wild. This wasn't even the end of the aquatic meat classification bonanza. Muskrats got the fish treatment in Detroit, barnacle geese in Ireland, even puffins in parts of coastal Europe. The pattern was always the same. local clergy with meat-hungry congregations, a semi-aquatic creature, and a carefully worded petition emphasizing water contact over biological reality. In Venezuela today, capybara is still officially acceptable during Lent. Millions consume it every year during Holy Week, blessed by centuries-old church rulings that were never rescinded. The Beaver loophole revealed something profound about institutional power. Once you establish the authority to redefine categories, the specific categories almost don't matter. Those medieval monks weren't just hungry gluttons gaming the system. They were testing the limits of theological authority. And they discovered those limits were far more flexible than anyone expected. From 1217 to today, the Great Beaver Scandal teaches us that sometimes the most absurd historical footnotes reveal the deepest truths about how power justifies itself. So the next time someone tells you that institutions are bound by logic and consistency, remember the French monks who convinced the Pope that a beaver is a fish. Because in the end, they didn't just win a loophole. They proved that with enough persistence, confidence, and bureaucratic creativity, you can convince the world's most powerful institution that reality is negotiable. The beaver meat loophole, 340 years of ecclesiastical nonsense that somehow made perfect sense to everyone involved. And technically, still does. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and check out other videos.